This is Brooke, and I would like to welcome you to a very special episode of Spiritual Storytelling. This is a weekly podcast where we work through myth, legend, and folklore to get better insight into ourselves as we heal from trauma and addiction. I just want to mention before we get started that we are live on iTunes, y'all. This is so exciting! Check us out there or on Google Podcasts, TuneIn, Podcast Addict, or Stitcher. I'm making my way onto most commonly used podcast platforms. So I've got my eye on Spotify. That'll be coming out soon, but stay tuned for that. But with that out of the way, welcome to episode 3. This is The Lady of Shalott, breaking the curse of emotional unavailability and embracing the divine feminine. I've decided to break this episode down into 2 parts. One reason is because it's one of my all-time favorites, and it's been such an intrinsic part of my own journey. So I definitely want to really do it the justice that it deserves. But also, there's a really rich history behind this story, and I think that is a really crucial context for understanding both the beauty and the wisdom that it has to offer us. And I also want to mention that I'll be diving into my experiences with the divine feminine. But this isn't to say that all of these experiences or wounds are limited to women. People, no matter how they identify, hold these elements within them. And I'm using this language simply because it is the closest and most meaningful to my own experiences. This is not to exclude anyone. Masculine and feminine are generalizations of character traits that we all possess. And I invite you to just gently investigate within yourself, no matter where you lie on the spectrum of gender. All are welcome and cherished here. So, The Lady of Shalott was first written by Alfred Lord Tennyson in 1833, and it was later revised to the version we know today in 1842. The poem was a creative reworking of a 13th century Italian short story, La Damigella di Scarlatti, which tells the older story of Elaine of Astolat. She's the lily maiden whose unrequited love for Lancelot ultimately doomed her. Elaine's story can be traced at least as far back to as around 1225 to 1237 in France. It was, as far as I can tell, attributed to a piece called the Lancelot Proper, which is a part of what's called the Vulgate cycle. The Vulgate cycle, or the Lancelot Grail, was essentially an attempt to tie together many of the well-known legends of King Arthur, Lancelot and Guinevere, and the Holy Grail into one mythos. And if you don't super love like literary history, I'm sorry. This will just take a second. Lancelot proper was the selection that dealt primarily with Lancelot and his adventures, as well as his love for Guinevere. These stories were already well known in the oral tradition by then, but this suggests that their origins go back to probably pre-Christian pagan mythology. So we don't know who wrote this cycle or mythos, but in the case of the Lancelot Grail, it claims to be translated from its original Latin and to have originated in the time of Arthur himself. All that's to say that this is a story that goes way back in the human psyche. So collectively, we have been haunted for centuries by this notion that we can die a sacrificial death from unrequited love. Tennyson also covers Elaine's story in his Idylls of the King, with a section called Lancelot and Elaine. So today I'm going to be working with his poetic reimagining, and part 2 will deal more with the details from that selection. These 2 pieces themselves are very distinct and different. The storylines are not exactly matched up, but when we view them together, they give us a much larger portrait of what it is to sacrifice our creative and intuitive energy for an emotionally unavailable partner. So we'll start with the Lady of Shalott. Some of these words are Old English, y'all, so it might sound a little funny here and there. And just as an aside, If you happen to fall in love with this poem like I did, there is a lovely composition by Lorena McKenna, and she puts this poem to music, and it's absolutely gorgeous. So if you're into it, check it out. On either side the river lie long fields of barley and of rye, that clothe the wold and meet the sky, and through the field the road run by to many towered Camelot. And up and down the people go, gazing where the lilies blow, round an island there below, the island of Shalott. Willows whiten, aspens quiver, little breezes dusk and shiver through the wave that runs forever by the island in the river, flowing down to Camelot. 4 grey walls and 4 grey towers overlook a space of flowers, and the silent isle embowers the Lady of Shalott. By the margin, willow veiled, slide the heavy barges trailed by slow horses and unhailed. The shallop flitteth silken sailed, skimming down to Camelot. But who hath seen her wave her hand, or at the casement seen her stand? Or is she known in all the land, the Lady of Shalott? Only reapers, reaping early, in among the beaded barley, hear a song that echoes cheerly from the river winding clearly down to towered Camelot. And by the moon the reaper weary, piling sheaves in uplands airy, listening whispers, 'tis the fairy, the Lady of Shalott. There she weaves by night and day a magic web with colors gay. She has heard a whisper say, a curse is on her if she stay to look down to Camelot. She knows not what the curse may be, and so she weaveth steadily, and little other care hath she, the Lady of Shalott. And moving through a mirror clear that hangs before her all the year, shadows of the world appear. There she sees the highway near, winding down to Camelot. There the river eddy whirls, and there the surly village churls, and the red cloaks of the market girls pass onward from Shalott. Sometimes a troop of damsels glad, an abbot on an ambling pad, sometimes a curly shepherd lad, or long-haired page in crimson clad, goes by to towered Camelot. And sometimes through the mirror blue the knights come riding 2 and 2. She hath no loyal knight and true, the Lady of Shalott. But in her web she still delights to weave the mirror's magic sights, for often through the silent nights a funeral with plumes and lights and music went to Camelot. Or when the moon was overhead, came 2 young lovers lately wed. I'm half sick of shadows, she said, the Lady of Shalott. A bow shot from her bower eaves, he rode between the barley sheaves. The sun came dazzling through the leaves, and flamed upon the brazen greaves of bold Sir Lancelot. A Red Cross knight forever kneeled to a lady in his shield that sparkled on the yellow field beside remote Shalott. The Jimmy bridle glittered free, like to some branch of stars we see, hung in the golden galaxy. The bridle bells rang merrily as he rode down to Camelot. And from his blazing baldric slung a mighty silver bugle hung, and as he rode his armor rung beside remote Shalott. All in the blue, unclouded weather, Thick jeweled shone the saddle leather, the helmet and the helmet feather burned like one burning flame together as he rode down to Camelot. As often through the purple night, below the starry clusters bright, some bearded meteor trailing light moves over still Shalott. His broad clear brow in sunlight glowed, on burnished hooves his warhorse trode, from underneath his helmet flowed his coal-black curls as on he rode, as he rode down to Camelot. From the bank and from the river he flashed into the crystal mirror. Tira lira by the river, sang Sir Lancelot. She left the web, she left the loom. She made 3 paces through the room. She saw the water lily bloom. She saw the helmet and the plume. She looked down to Camelot. Out flew the web and floated wide. The mirror cracked from side to side. The curse is come upon me, cried the Lady of Shalott. In the stormy east wind straining, the pale yellow woods were waning, the broad stream in his banks complaining. Heavily the low sky raining over towered Camelot. Down she came and found a boat, beneath a willow left afloat, and round about the prow she wrote, the Lady of Shalott. And down the river's dim expanse, like some bold seer in a trance, seeing all his own mischance, with a glassy countenance did she look to Camelot. And at the closing of the day, she loosed the chain, and down she lay. The broad stream bore her far away, the Lady of Shalott. Lying, robed in snowy white, that loosely flew to left and right, the leaves upon her falling light, through the noises of the night, she floated down to Camelot. And as the boat head wound along, the willowy hills and fields among, they heard her singing her last song, the Lady of Shalott. Heard a carol mournful, holy, chanted loudly, chanted lowly, till her blood was frozen slowly, and her eyes were darkened wholly, turned to towered Camelot. For ere she reached upon the tide, the first house by the waterside, singing in her song she died, the Lady of Shalott. Under tower and balcony, by garden wall and gallery, a gleaming shape she floated by, dead pale between the houses high, silent into Camelot. Out upon the wharfs they came, knight and burgher, lord and dame, and round the prow they read her name, the Lady of Shalott. Who is this, and what is here? And in the lighted palace near died the sound of royal cheer, and they crossed themselves for fear, all the knights at Camelot. But Lancelot mused a little space. He said, she has a lovely face. God in his mercy lent her grace, the Lady of Shalott. So just in case anyone kind of struggled to follow this, I'm just going to summarize it really quickly. So we have a woman who lives in a tower composed of 4 gray walls that overlooks Camelot. She has a magic mirror that reflects to her the goings-on the road below her, and she weaves in ornate colors and designs what she sees. She hears a whisper tell her that she will be cursed if she ever stops weaving and looks down on Camelot. with her own eyes. So she just keeps weaving. She doesn't care so much for anything else, and she never leaves. And this is why no one but the reapers reaping early know that she exists. They only know this because they hear her singing from the tower. And even then, they whisper about her. They ascribe her song to a sort of mythical fairy. So as she's weaving, she sees a funeral procession and then a pair of newlyweds in the mirror. And her attitude begins to change. So she starts getting tired of the shadows of reality. She starts mourning because she is so isolated. So not long after this, she glances Lancelot through her mirror, who is described as a Red Cross knight who forever kneeled to a lady in his shield. Meaning, I think that he bows to his country, he bows to what is on his shield, but more specifically in Lancelot's case, this would be to his queen, Guinevere, who he fights for. So he appears to her as this meteoric vision. She's overwhelmed by just the glory that she sees reflected to her. So she jumps up to look out the window. And when she does, her magic mirror cracks, and the web that she was weaving floats off the loom. Knowing that this curse has now been fulfilled, she decides to leave her tower, and when she does, she finds a boat, which she writes her name on and takes out to kind of just explore the world. So as she's exploring and singing her last song, her blood freezes in her veins and she dies. And the boat then washes up by a house close to the palace. All the royalty that were, filled with royal cheer in the palace come running out to see what this is, and they cross themselves for fear because they don't know who this is, and they're kind of scandalized by all of a sudden there's this dead pale woman in a boat. The only exception to this is Lancelot, who takes a minute to kind of just look on her and take into consideration what he's seeing, and he then remarks how beautiful she is and says a prayer for her. So the story in this poem is chock full of metaphor. So we're going to deal first with the lady herself. This is a woman who sees the world not as it is, but as it is reflected to her. So mirrors have a really heavily loaded symbolism, especially in fairy tales, because often they're tools specifically of women who wish to see into other realms, may it be past or future, or even the realms of the supernatural. We often associate them with magic or witches, and they can act as a doorway in fairy tales to places beyond the typical human realm. And as a matter of fact, they're still used today to scry or to gaze into, with the goal being to have a vision that is significant and otherworldly. In that way, mirrors are powerful tools representing intuition, magic, perception, and fantasy. We don't see the things that are in them, nor do we see the mirrors themselves, but we see a reflection of the world that depends on the angle with which we choose to look. And we also here have the weaving metaphor. And I'll just say, I could create a whole podcast dedicated to how weaving is intertwined with both women and storytelling, but I'll try to keep this brief and relevant. Essentially, spinning and weaving was primarily women's work, as was the preservation and telling of family stories, cultural stories, fairy tales. This was all kind of the women's realm. And often the two went hand in hand. So think about the Fates. These are three goddesses who weave and cut the threads of fate, according to Greek mythology. And also, Claire Testoni also gives a really wonderful discussion in her episode exploring Rumpelstiltskin on the Singing Bones podcast, where she recalls the way in which our language reflects the connection between storytelling and weaving. We say things like spinning a tale or the webs we weave, which, by the way, originally used to mean that when we, as my southern family would say, tell a story or a lie, we create a mess for everyone involved. By weaving the reflections of the mirror, the Lady of Shalott is creating a reality, a story about what she sees. This is the narrative that she lives in, especially because she is so isolated. She is cursed to never see things as they really are, and is therefore isolated only to her own mind. This becomes highly problematic when she sees Lancelot reflected in the mirror. He's like a strike of lightning to her. He's so overwhelmingly glorious that it's startling, it's compelling. But based on the reflection that she sees, she chooses to pursue him to her own detriment, despite the fact that she has never seen him as he is, that is to say, outside of the mirror. So, how many times might we chase someone or put ourselves out there before we even really know who or what someone is about? Had she actually seen Lancelot as he was, or in other words, got to know him before she fell madly in love with him, she would come to know pretty quickly that he was inherently unavailable. The poem itself tells us that he kneels essentially only to Guinevere and is not available to reciprocate any feelings that she has for him. It's not even personal. He says that she's lovely, that she's beautiful, but that doesn't mean that he can return her sacrificial passion. So when dealing with love addiction and intimacy issues, we tend to create realities or characters for people. We might see people from our own angle in the mirror and glorify them to mythical heights. We look at the things that we like about them and we amplify those things, while we minimize and deny any parts that don't suit our narrative, so any red flags that we see. Often we are too caught up in our own fantasy in creating characters for ourselves too that come at a really high cost. So when we try to fit someone else or even a group of people, we tend to do the same things to ourselves. We amplify the elements of ourselves that will be approved and accepted, and then we minimize the parts of ourselves that may stand out or complicate the perfect fit that we've created. And in that way, a person ends up being willing to sacrifice themselves for an idea that they don't even know actually exists. Ultimately, we can't see the world as it actually stands in front of us, only our own fantasy of what it could be. And so we charge towards it, not caring about our own safety or well-being. We don't care that we are willing to sacrifice ourselves to have the fantasy. We don't care that the fantasy will never be attained. Our intuitive power, or in this case, our mirror, cracks and red flags turn invisible. Our creative power is also at risk here, guys. Like, the web on the loom becomes unraveled as we play things out. So that's to say, eventually we have to admit that what we're chasing is not the fantasy that we created in our head. We didn't end up on fire and hot with passion. We ended up with our blood frozen in our veins, the songs still on our lips. With that creative energy lost and severed from parts of ourselves that we've minimized, we're left cold and closed off to the world. This is not to say that the Lady of Shalott should have stayed isolated, only to say that she is doomed to act on a distorted narrative. And I think this is where we get into the divine feminine. Creating reality through either storytelling or the way cool physical act of growing a new freaking human inside of us is really beautiful feminine energy. And because of this, it tends to be natural for us to stay connected to a deeper well of unity with others. We naturally tend to wade into empathy and intuition with ease, making us capable of access to worlds beyond our own. In some ways, too, we can also see how the feminine creative powers have no outlet in a patriarchal world. Whether it's gray walls or yellow wallpaper, women's abilities to create reality often get trapped and distorted. The isolation and disregard of these powers takes its toll. They can't survive the stuffy enclosure, but they can't survive in the analytical and state-oriented masculine world. Notice that the lady is so isolated that even as readers, we are denied access into her interiority. She is hidden and mythic, as much to us as to the reapers in the story. We don't get to know what she thinks or feels, but only what is reflected in her words. See what I did there? And that's the frustrating irony of this poem, y'all. Like, it warns us against chasing reflections of shiny things, from pursuing them and taking them at face value. But the poem itself is just that, a shiny reflection, a grand and mythic perspective of a beautiful woman and her doomed love. Living or dead, the lady is never seen as she is, any more than she sees others as they are. She is forever characterized. Which, I mean, yeah, like, I get it. She is a literal fictional character, but I think you know what I'm saying. But this brings me back to love addiction. When we create these fantasies in our head, around ourselves and others, we reinforce the cycle. When we downplay parts of ourselves to fit into the story that we've created, we cannot be known in our entirety. And so it makes it that much more difficult to embrace the invisible parts of ourselves and share them with others. It creates a cycle of compartmentalization that encourages us to hide, to distract, to manipulate, in order to achieve the one thing that is steadfastly out of our reach: true intimacy. I'm going to stop here for now, but be sure to tune in for part 2. If you like what you heard today, let me know. Like, subscribe, or comment. Reviews on iTunes are especially helpful and can really impact the reach of this little dream of mine. And if you want to know a little more about me or about the characters we create for ourselves, check out craftingwholeness.com. This is a collection of my writing throughout my personal journey and a few of the lessons that I've learned along the way. This is Brooke, and with deep love and gratitude, I want to thank you for tuning in to Spiritual Storytelling.